So, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana finally got to table his budget speech, and this is going to be discussed at great detail. And there are bigger issues than just the budget that came out of yesterday. But joining me today to analyze what went on in the budget, firstly the speech, and then secondly the ramifications of the actions by many of the other parties and politicians involved. We have Ismail Joosub, who's a manager of constitutional development at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. Ismail, welcome to the State of the Nation. Great to have somebody new on the State of the Nation. Welcome aboard.
Somebody new, somebody young, and a fan of State of the Nation. Mike, it's a pleasure and privilege to be with you today.
And good looking, that helps, because I've got all the old and ugly taken care of, so we need to build that part of what we present on this channel. But Ismail, let's dive straight in. Obviously, given the problems with the previous attempt to present a budget speech, which was rebuffed by the GNU partners, largely around the proposed in the previous time 2% increase in VAT to cover the government spending shortfall, a speech was tabled, but it still has an increase in VAT. The intention is to increase VAT by 1%, with 0.5% this financial year and 0.5% next financial year. And that seems to have got all of the headlines, because that was the issue that stymied them the last time. What do you make of that proposal? Do we start there with VAT, or do we look at what's causing the problem?
A little bit of both. Mike, the best place to begin is with me being characteristically clear and candid about the problem at hand. In our present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Now, having listened to yesterday's budget speech, I am concerned. I'm concerned that the budget is a profound disservice to the people of South Africa. I believe it perpetuates a cycle of wasteful expenditure and systematic corruption that benefits but a small cadre of elite politicians, leaving the average citizen burdened and disenfranchised. I'm also concerned about other aspects of the speech. I'm concerned about our high debt to GDP ratio. I'm concerned about our GDP growth. GDP growth at 0.6%, Mike. Surely we as a country can do better than that. When I say our high debt to GDP ratio, that's now 75%, that means, and the minister said it yesterday, that 22 cents out of every rand is spent servicing our debt. And who bears the burden? The government has now shifted the burden effectively onto citizens by approving, or not by approving, but rather by tabling this VAT increase. And more than anything, Mike, let me say that I'm also concerned about this long-standing and now somewhat increased social grants that we have, which to my opinion only perpetuate a cycle of dependency and entitlement mentality that serves as a band-aid solution to a long-term problem. It isn't a long-term fix, and it was never meant to be a permanent fix anything. But you're right, more than anything, I really am concerned about that 1% VAT increase, and that's what I'd really like to speak on today.
Okay, but before we can get to the VAT increase, because as you say, that's trying to solve the problem. And the way, this is hardly sort of new news, we know this. We've got two problems in the fiscus at the moment. One is lack of economic growth, and the other is over expenditure, neither of which was dealt with this budget. Did you see anything in this budget that supports economic growth? Because I have looked high and low, and I can't find anything that supports economic growth.
Look, Mike, the problems that we have are no economic growth, but we also have a problem of a small tax base. When you look at South Africa and you look at the tax base, you see that a small portion of the population supports a very large portion of the population as per their taxes. I've also looked high and low in this budget to find anything of substance that could possibly lead to greater economic growth. The only thing that seems to me to be a silver lining is the 1 trillion rand that's to be used for infrastructure, but that too comes at a cost. Now, I'll speak about that. Really, the problem is the wasteful expenditure. And let me touch on that, Mike, if I may. Indeed, you are right to say that This is Budget Speech 2.0. The budget had been scheduled to take place on the 19th of February. What went wrong? There were disagreements within the Government of National Unity. Famously, we know that the DA had disagreed vehemently for any increase on VAT, and indeed they still do. Now, the problem there is, how is this tabled budget going to be passed? You remember now the budget still has to be tabled in Parliament, it has to be put to portfolio committees, and then indeed it needs to have a simple majority of 50+1. But speaking about that wasteful expenditure, which really is the overarching answer to your question, President Ramaphosa himself had conceded that government revenue was insufficient to fund every priority, highlighting a financial shortfall as the main significant concern. This was after the first budget speech, the first shot at the budget speech. But this shortfall, however, is not merely a result of external economic pressures, but is deeply rooted in the government's mismanagement of funds. When I speak about wasteful expenditure, when I speak about the mismanagement of various entities, various state-owned entities, when I speak about pervasive corruption, when I speak also about a reliance on external borrowing, all of these have severely eroded our nation's financial foundation. So let me first say that this proposed increase in VAT is a direct assault on hardworking South Africans as a result of the sins of the government. Now, let's put the math to it, Mike. The 2% VAT proposal back on the 19th of Feb, what would that have done revenue-wise for South Africa? Well, doing the math, we see that that would have put 58 billion rands more in the pocket, in the fiscus of the government. So then naturally, logically, mathematically speaking, this 1% VAT increase, which comes into effect fully in 2026, would put about 42.5 billion rands into the revenue over the next 3 years. Remember that figure, 42.5 billion rands over the next 2 or 3 years into the government's revenue. But now let's break that down. When we see the actual cost of wasteful expenditure, when we see the actual harm on paper to what it's doing to the economy, the math simply doesn't math. Listen to this, Mike. 2.57 billion rands in 2023 and 2024 were classified as wasteful or fruitless expenditure. That was a 49% increase from the previous year, and one can only imagine what that figure must be standing like today. Listen to this, Mike. South Africa spends 1 billion rand a day on operational inefficiencies and infrastructure neglect, particularly within key sectors like energy and logistics, which are the main sectors that are supposed to drive economic growth. Listen to this, Mike. We find that in terms of irregular expenditure in municipalities have incurred irregular expenditure totaling some 30 billion rands by 2017, and one can only imagine what that figure must be looking like today. So in simple, South Africa's financial struggles are not due to insufficient taxation. It's not a matter of not taxing people enough. In fact, we must get to the root of the problem here. The root of the problem is that government is, in fact, the problem. Government not being able to manage funds properly, and government now trying to shift the blame onto citizens. We don't need more taxes for citizens in South Africa. We need a bigger tax base in South Africa with less taxes overall to support all of the priorities that the government has. Those same priorities that President Ramaphosa has once said that we don't have revenue to support all of. Now, lastly, my word on the matter is this, and it's a startling figure, Mike. 38 billion rands have been lost to wasteful expenditure in 2023-2024. Remember I told you that we would have gained 42.5 billion rands from this 1% VAT increase? Well, if 38 billion rands per year is being lost, then surely those two figures cancel out. And if those two figures cancel out, then there was no need to have had a 1% VAT increase in the first place if government got its priorities in order.
Yeah, but I suppose the reality is that most of that fruitless and wasteful expenditure is in the hands of politicians, and we know which side of the aisle those politicians are that are benefiting from that. So, on the basis that turkeys do not vote for Christmas, we're not going to have, and we've got the hollowing out of our judicial system. We see Shamila Batoy, who kind of is yet to have one prosecution. That's going to continue unabated. That's kind of baked in. And on the other hand, the absolute bloat is done largely through cadre deployment, state-owned companies, with which have got more than 700. There's been no effort to trim that at all, is there?
There's been no effort to trim that at all. Let me say this, is that the bloated government in itself costs South Africans a lot of money. And the question, Mike, that we, you and I, ordinary South Africans, normal average taxpayers, must ask ourselves from a financial standpoint is whether we're getting a fair return on investment for sending politicians into those high positions that they occupy. Are they doing enough for us to get a bang out of our buck for every rand's worth of tax that we pay? I think not. There have been many attempts by parties outside of government, by the opposition parties, to try and force bills through to trim the size of government, particularly to cut deputy ministers, right? Now, when you do the math on that, you find that cutting deputy ministers, assume hypothetically there were no deputy ministers, that would save South Africa some 3 to 6 billion rands. But 3 to 6 billion rand still pales in comparison to the 3 trillion rand budget that was tabled yesterday. What it does, though, let me say, is by creating a culture of non-corruption in government, by asserting lifestyle audits onto politicians to find out exactly where the hole is in our budget, we're then able to at least force government into the right direction to say that while we're giving you this money in terms of our taxes, we then are holding you accountable as the Constitution requires. It's very important, Mike, that South Africa must manage its finances properly, and the only way for us to do that is to manage South Africa as though it were a well-oiled machine, as though it were a private corporation, as though it were South Africa Inc. And South Africa Inc. can't be giving away grants to 47% of the population and still bragging about that in State of the Nation addresses. South Africa Inc. can't be having a hole in its budget in terms of wasteful expenditure, and South Africa Inc. can't be run by a board, in this case a cabinet, when quite frankly many of those ministers are there and collect large salaries but don't give a fair return on investment for their services to the people of South Africa.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to be a super auditor to ask the question how when Nomvula Mokonyane was a minor minister in the previous administration, she was able to buy an Aston Martin, which goes at just over 3 million rand. Yeah, you don't have to be some kind of super accountant to work out that that money comes from somewhere else. But I want to spend more time on something that goes right up your alley, and that is that this is going to create what we saw in the budget speech, has to create a constitutional crisis. And I'm not sure that we've all rushed to analyze the numbers, which is kind of what we would normally do with the budget. But I want to spend some time discussing the political fallout that's going to come out of this, because we saw John Steenhuisen from the DA say that he's not going to support this budget, which means that the DA will not vote for it. We do know that the euphemistically called Progressive Caucus, I can't stop myself from laughing because they call themselves that, but let's to give them a name, that's the MK, EFF, etc. They're not going to vote in favor of this VAT increase budget. The ANC, quite simply, is going to struggle to get 50% plus one to get this budget passed. What happens next?
I think it's going to be very difficult. And let me say that from where I'm sitting, I don't think South Africa is going to go into a constitutional crisis. I think that indeed we are already in a constitutional crisis. Section 215 of the Constitution says that the budget must be utilized in a manner that's transparent, that holds that where the people spending that money must be accountable, and that's used in the most economically efficient manner possible. And that hasn't happened. And because that hasn't happened, that in itself is particularly unconstitutional. Corruption and mismanagement are particularly unconstitutional. But I get where you're going with the question, talking about the political fallout, and let me say it's going to be a very, very difficult juggling act for all of the parties in the GNU to try and either amend this budget or to get it passed. Now, let's look at where we are currently. The ANC no longer has the throne of being called a majority party. They now sit at just 40%. And you can't pass a budget with 40%. You need a simple majority, a 50% plus one majority to pass a budget. Now, DA, as you know, yesterday has said particularly that they don't support this budget, that what they support, in fact, is a pro-growth and pro-jobs agenda. And quite frankly, I agree with that. What's going to happen now is that the DA finds itself in a very, very difficult situation indeed. Do they concede and give in and indeed vote with the ANC on this budget? And that puts them in a difficult position going into the next elections. Where does the EFF stand? Well, we see that the EFF has said that they'd only support the budget if they're given an in into the GNU. But if the EFF is given an in into the GNU, the DA leaves the GNU, and so you lose your majority anyway. I think the most pragmatic thing, the most realistic thing that will happen is that some of the smaller parties in the GNU, the Patriotic Alliance, the Good Party, perhaps Rise Mzansi, these will support the ANC. These will buy into the notion that Minister Godongwana had to make certain concessions, that there had to be a trade-off between personal taxes like income tax or increasing the VAT, that they'd buy into that and simply to get the country moving. But even if the budget is stalemated, that doesn't put us in as big a crisis as we think. Remember, the budget from last year carries over right up until May this year. And so it doesn't mean that we'd be without money as a country right up until May. What would happen is that now the parties will have to debate it out and have to find common ground on how this budget can indeed be passed. Hopefully it's altered somewhat and not passed in its current form. But I do believe that it sets us on a very bad trajectory into the future because it doesn't take into consideration the long-term solutions that South Africa would need to get itself back onto pace. We're very far from achieving the 3 to 5% GDP growth rate that economists would like to put us at.
Yeah, and there doesn't, it looks like it's going to be so difficult for the conflicting ideas to reach one another, especially within the GNU. Because, there's not one concession to economic growth. I mean, the minister said economic growth will come because this is a stable budget. I don't see where it's stable, because I presume what he's referring to is that debt won't increase, but debt isn't decreasing. In fact, debt to GDP is sort of forecast to go from 75 to 76%. So if you call going up as being stable, then yeah, I suppose, that's stability. But there's nothing in this budget that is going to stimulate economic activity. You mentioned the infrastructure spend, that still has to go through tenders, and that doesn't mean that a building gets built. It just means that there's money, and that could disappear into deep, dark holes. So I don't see how these parties find each other here. Because, right now, the DA has laid down their marker on no VAT increases. If any of the other, call them supposedly pro-poor parties, and they are pro-poor because they'll keep the poor forever, so they definitely are pro-poor, but none of those parties will want to be seen to be raising VAT either, for different reasons. They want crazy taxes on corporations and that. So where do we go to from here?
Absolutely right. The biggest challenge in the GNU is how to mesh the ideological battle of ideas together and to come out with some concession that would move the country forward. My biggest fear is that the GNU doesn't find itself ideologically and the country doesn't move forward and stagnates and there's no economic growth whatsoever. You see, Mike, the DA... That
shouldn't be a fear because we're there already.
Absolutely, we're there already. We've seen that already. We've seen it most direly with what's happening in South Africa's external playing field, with what's happening in America, for instance. I think the DA is a proponent of the free market, at least they advocate for themselves to be. The ANC pretends like it's not an enemy of the free market, though sometimes we might question that. But you're absolutely right in saying that no political party in South Africa, if they were in power, if they were the ones who had a minister tabling this budget, would want to increase taxes, specifically VAT, which disproportionately affects middle and low household individuals, right? Where to from here ideologically? Well, I think what must happen in terms of economic growth, but probably won't happen, but it's nice to put it out there. What must happen is that South Africa should focus on alternative solutions to expanding the tax base. And you can only do this by applying good old-fashioned market-style Milton Friedman economics. And the only way to do that would be to, well, instead of focusing so much, a large portion of your budget, for instance, on unnecessary things like, defense spending, perhaps you could give tax breaks instead of tax increases for startups and for small and medium enterprises. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Youth unemployment is probably the highest in the world. And youth are unemployed not because it's the government's job to create jobs and they're not doing their job at creating jobs. It's not the government's job to create jobs. It's the government's job to create an economic playing field that's conducive for the private sector to create jobs. And so unless we fix these systematic issues, unless we reduce our rigid labor laws, for instance, unless we reduce the minimum wage, which simply discriminates on people who don't have the skills and leads to widespread retrenchment, unless we give tax cuts to corporates to attract foreign direct investment or even more investment here at home, unless we do all of those things and get more people into jobs and expand the tax base and stop hurting the small portion of taxpayers in South Africa who pay the majority of tax, and unless South Africa stops giving away grants like charity, well, only then will we have economic growth in South Africa. None of that has been laid out in the budget speech. And so what we're going to have to do as a country is to simply leave it to those who are in power, the DA specifically, the ANC as two of the largest stakeholders in the government of national unity, but not just them, every single South African, to rally behind economic growth insofar as we must participate publicly. We call for the reducing of rigid labor laws. We call for the creation of special economic zones. We call for the calling to accountability of government officials. We call for lifestyle audits. And unless we get these systematic issues corrected, we will not have economic growth in South Africa. And that's the simple matter of it.
Ismail, I'd like to just end off with a look into, South Africa finds itself in the international crosshairs. For many years, we've lived off the fumes of fighting apartheid, and that allowed us to do pretty much anything we wanted to do. That has subsided, and the world is not happy just to let us live off those memories. We know that under the Trump administration in America, South Africa is quite firmly in the sights for a whole host of reasons. And we have seen also that the US has not been afraid to get involved and have to make comments and to make decisions based on our internal policies. Do you think that this is yet another part of some more fuel to the fire of what's going to come to South Africa's growing isolation within the world?
Well, I think what it's going to do is it's going to throw us economically from the frying pan into the fire. Look at AGOA, for instance, Mike. South Africa gains $3 billion a year from AGOA, from trade with the US. Now, if that is sidelined, certainly that would hurt revenue. And then you'd have politicians who want to shove the burden onto citizens. I think we can learn from America. I think we need a Department of Government Efficiency. We need our own Doge in South Africa to get our government to operate more efficiently, and perhaps that would allow the revenue to be utilized more economically, which would be what the Constitution demands, but would also be what citizens want. Now, to answer your question directly, for too long, South Africa has been the golden boy of international diplomacy. It seemed as though we could do no wrong. And I don't agree with what AfriForum and Solidarity have done by not using our state institutions to air their grievances, whatever their grievances might be, right or wrong. And let me say on those grievances, white people in South Africa have never had it better in South Africa, despite the tax rates, despite the harsh economic playing field, despite an uncertain future. The Afrikaner culture, the Afrikaner economy has seemed to be growing by leaps and bounds. Now, regardless of that, I think this gives us a golden opportunity for South Africa to recalibrate, to ask ourselves, where do we want to position ourselves in the world? We know what America's playing field is. We know what Donald Trump's deal book looks like. Well, his hymn sheet simply says, if you're not with us, then you're against us. And so that forces us now into a corner, unfortunately. What's going to happen is that the fault lines are going to be drawn. South Africa can now choose. Either we side with the East, with countries like China and Russia, who we don't have that much trade with, or with our largest trading partners like America, like the West, like the European Union. So South Africa needs to make that choice very carefully. And South Africa needs to make that choice cognizant not just of what it means for the ANC in terms of the Soviet Union perhaps having supported the ANC back in the apartheid era, or the West having imposed sanctions on the apartheid government during that era. South Africa now needs to take a pragmatic approach. Now really is a time, Mike, for the South African government to employ realpolitik and to have a transactional mindset, to focus on its citizens and to say, what will benefit citizens the most? Well, we know that not making an enemy of America will certainly benefit the citizens. That's where our trade comes from. Sanctions would cripple us. US aid and PEPFAR have already, to an extent, crippled us. And now, as I say, because of all of this, the government is trying to shift the economic burden, the financial burden, onto its citizens. It's a tough choice for South Africa to make. It's a tough choice to make, especially in light of misinformation and disinformation coming from certain groups in South Africa. It is going to sow a lot of division at home. We, as a South African population, need to guard against this. We must not let it divide us, but we must take it as a wake-up call.
Yeah, and I think the one thing, if I could take to task, one of the things you said is that you said every forum should have used structures to lay their grievances. Well, the Democratic Alliance are in a government of national unity with the ANC, and they couldn't even get them to listen to their points of view. So I don't think every forum are going to get much leverage out of speaking to any government official. But anyway, we'll leave it there. And on your point of South Africa needing its own version of the Department of Government Efficiency, I'm going to put up a link to a piece I did about Doge's coming, whether we like it or not. Because if anything has hurried and hastened the coming of a department similar to Doge in South Africa, it's this budget. Because we quite simply can't pay for what we want. And the poor do not have the money to bail us out. Ismail, thank you for being so clear on this subject. We're definitely going to get you back onto the State of the Nation. Thank you so much for joining us. To Pace Car Rental, thank you for sponsoring us. And to everybody that watched this today, stay tuned to the State of the Nation. Subscribe to the channel so that you can get our alerts. Ring the bell. And we will see you again on the State of the Nation. Ismail, Joosub, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much to all of the State of the Nation listeners.